Thanks, everybody. I'm sure as members of the Mining History Association, everybody has lots of patience here. So thank you for that. So I'm a pretty new member of the association. I guess I've been a member for about a year. I really like some of the things I see in the journal and in the newsletter, and a few of the nuggets I've been able to watch. I think the Mining History Association does some pretty cool stuff, and I'm super happy to be part of that. And I wanted to share with this group some sort of preliminary results of a rephotography project I've been doing in the Comstock area for the last several years. And just some dots appearing on the old map here. This is actually where some of the camera locations are going to be. So we're going to focus on the Virginia City Gold Hill area and then make our way down to the Carson River. And the title here, 1.5 centuries of landscape change and a peek into the future. You're going to see a variety of changes over this century and a half. And, oftentimes I think that when we can look back in time and in history and see what's happened, what things were like then, what they are today, it's not a bad indication of what the future might hold for us. So that there's really been two main early photographers up on the Comstock. Of course, Timothy O'Sullivan. He was with the Wheeler Survey in the 1860s, and many of his photographs are really quite iconic. They occurred in the reports of the Wheeler Survey, and since O'Sullivan has been regarded as one of the true photographic artists of the day, and his photographs are widely reproduced. Carlton Watkins is a guy who kind of disappeared from the radar screen after a very prolific period of professional photography throughout the American West. And he's kind of been recently discovered, and the cool thing about him is he left an amazingly large collection of really high resolution photographs, because he marched around the Western US with a massive wet plate camera that took huge negatives from which his prints were made. And there's a lot of detail and resolution in these things. So these are the two photographers I've been chasing around the camp. And when, that was the sort of the who. The when is O'Sullivan was in Comstock during the first peak with the survey that was actually getting started on doing some geologic and topographic mapping there. And then Watkins came out just after the big fire in 1875. And, probably he was sent out there for commercial interest to show that the city was being rebuilt. The mining was still taking place. Massive amounts of wealth were still being created. And, for sure, if you want photographers to show up, just create a lot of wealth and they will be there. So that's when these two guys were there and sort of why they were there. The inspiration for this, for me, is I've actually been doing rephotography for a while. I started off in Mongolia chasing the Central Asiatic expedition photographs of the Roy Chapman Andrews expeditions. So I got involved with the American Museum of Natural History and was doing that for several years until the pandemic shut down international travel pretty much, and I was looking for a project closer to home. And I had been exposed to these rephotography books by Mark Klett out of Arizona State University in Tempe. And of course, they actually ran around the Western US rephotographing a lot of Timothy O'Sullivan's photographs. So I had a bit of a starting point here. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, I highly recommend these two books. So, a very iconic image of Gold Hill from Timothy O'Sullivan. And Klett actually rephotographed this in 1984. And they came back about 15 years later, or 20 years later, I guess, in 2004, and shot it again. And then you can see another 20 years later when I shot it, it sort of looks like this. And, one of the differences that we're able to do these days, and, the CLET expeditions weren't really able to do this, is now we can capture GPS coordinates on all these locations and camera view angles. So now we have all this documented, and you don't really have to figure out where exactly was O'Sullivan standing, because trust me, it's a bit of a trick finding these locations if somebody hasn't been there before to guide you to it. So this is what, the glory hole looks like. Anybody who's driven through Gold Hill and up to Virginia City has driven on the highway in the lower part of the photograph here, and has certainly seen this big open cut on the west side of the road. But this is what it looked like back in the day, before the open cut was there, and all the mining was underground, actually. And like I said, now we have GPS coordinates. We can locate these things exactly and share this information so that, in the future, you don't even have to drive out here, right? You can program a drone to go get this view for you if you'd like. So that's kind of an interesting way to collect rephotography info with the precise 3D coordinates and the view angles here. And, O'Sullivan took a number of shots of Virginia City. It's kind of hard to understand what he was doing sometimes. He oftentimes liked to shoot into the sun. Maybe one of these days I'll forgive him. But I think on this day, he made actually 2 shots of Virginia City from the north side. And you see how the roofs on all these buildings are just gleaming? I suspect that it had just rained and the sun was bouncing off, either a tin roof or even a shake roof would have been highly reflective in those days. And I think this caught his attention, and he shot several photographs from this location. And you can see it's interesting to see where the road is today, where it was back in the day. Not some things haven't changed too much, and some things have changed a lot. And it's interesting to see what's changing and what isn't. So here's his second photograph from about 80 meters away. Not really sure why he moved his camera position over here to do this, but he apparently did. I think he was just mesmerized by all these roofs shining back into his eyes. But again, you can see the basic roadway into Virginia City was pretty much in place 150 years ago. We've simply straightened it out a bit and paved it. One thing you'll note, of course, in the O'Sullivan photographs is that the iconic church, St. Mary's in the Mountains, wasn't built yet. That was built in 1870. So he was there just a couple years too soon to see that. But of course, Watkins came by later, and the church was there, and that's one of the great landmarks in his photographs. And the last of the O'Sullivan photos, this is another iconic image that's often reproduced of Sugarloaf down in 6 Mile Canyon. And this was kind of a tough one to rephotograph because that's pretty much what it looks like today. And trees are going to be a theme of my talk today. You'll notice in all the old black and white photographs, there's just not very many trees. And that begs the question of why. Why wasn't there any trees? Why are there so many more trees today? And that's something we'll get to in a little bit, and maybe we can have some discussion about that at the end. So this is what that photograph looks like when you lay it in there without the trees, and you can see things. And actually the Rephotographic expedition, Mark Klett and his team, they came here and shot the same thing actually. And they struggled with this one because they're standing in a grove of trees trying to get this view. And you wonder why you're doing that, because what captures your eye in the O'Sullivan photograph is all the topography behind the infrastructure here, and you just can't see that from this view today because of the trees. So 8 years later, Watkins comes to the Comstock, and interestingly, he was obviously aware of O'Sullivan's photography from the various publications it had appeared in. There's no indication that the two gentlemen ever met each other, but it's highly probable that they did. But anyway, he came back and he started right at this iconic view of Sugarloaf and took another shot about 85 meters west of where O'Sullivan was. And again, look at the relative amount of trees here and what the scene looks like today. Amazing differences. But some things are still the same. The roadway is in about the same place. Of course, there aren't too many choices in a narrow canyon like this. And if you walk up the hills over here where you can see the infrastructure in the old photographs, sure enough, you can find traces of old ditch works and roads up on the hill, and it's all there. These are kind of a neat guide to go walking around and looking for things that aren't so obvious today. So Watkins, after he sort of did a riff on O'Sullivan, he hit his own stride in Virginia City and made some. Again, he was using this mammoth plate camera, which took a negative that was about 22 inches wide, and he made some really neat panoramic views of Virginia City, 3 or 4 images at a time. So you can imagine that you could have these things hanging on your wall and have 80 or 90 inches of super detailed photography. And this was quite the thing back in the day when most photographers were not using such large plates. So he was able to produce big wall scale displays with these things. And this is kind of an interesting image too when you think about the trees that are there now. And kudos to the Virginia and Truckee train enthusiasts who are keeping the train alive for us. We can actually capture an image today of the railroad system with a train on it 150 years ago and a train still working today. It's kind of fun to do this, and I was almost able to get these two trains to collide, but I didn't have quite enough patience to wait for the new one to get there yet. And then here's the dumps just on the slopes of Virginia City. So he's looking back more to the northwest here. This is what it looks like today. And all of these, this particular panel of panoramas was taken from just above the combination shaft in kind of an interesting location up in the trees. And there's so many trees up here that you sort of have to maneuver yourself around to get much of a view anymore. But back in Watkins' day, he didn't seem to be bothered by trees. It didn't seem like anybody was up here. There just weren't any. And then here's his view down 6 Mile Canyon of the Sugarloaf and the St. Mary's in the Mountains Church. Just an amazing photograph. And when Watkins showed up, and I'll show you in a minute, it was quite a production in town. He was a very well-known photographer in his day. He traveled in style. He had a team of people because he had these gigantic cameras to move around. And you can see the guys down in the lower center of the photograph posing for him. And this is a common theme in his photographs. There's almost always people posed, people doing things, and people are paying attention to the photographer and his work. And that wasn't really something you saw in O'Sullivan's work. And I dare say I don't see it in mine either. So this is what it looks like today, and it's kind of interesting just to click back and forth through these, and again, look at the relative amount of tree cover on the slopes, not just in Virginia City itself, but kind of as far away as you can see in the ranges. It's a pretty barren landscape. So who was Watkins? Like I said, he was kind of this enigmatic character based in San Francisco. But when he came to Virginia City in 1876, he actually found his future wife there. And he came back in 1878 and apparently took her home with him on that mission. And that was Frances Watkins, one of the belles of Virginia City. So, I'd like to say that Watkins found his own gold here in this amazing mining camp. And he named his first boy Collis, and this was because one of his friends was Collis Huntington, the Titan of the Central Pacific Railroad. And interestingly, they both came from the same place in New York, and they came out to San Francisco, possibly even on the same ship. They seemed to arrive at about the same time. So they were probably hometown friends. And as Huntington made his money and made his fortune, he sort of took Watkins under his wing and underwrote a lot of his photographic excursions. And, like many of the older photographers, there's just not any photographs of the photographer himself. And the best likeness of him is this cameo that he had made for his family. So kind of interesting, the photographers just, it wasn't in the days of the selfie, let's put it that way. So, he traveled in style, and here's his photographic wagon over here, parked at the railroad yard in Monterey. There's a zoom in of it. So, there were big cameras, lots of chemicals, every plate that he exposed out here weighed about 4 pounds. So this guy would travel around with, a couple thousand pounds of photographic equipment. This wasn't anything trivial. I got tired of lugging my heavy digital camera around, and then you start thinking about what this guy had to go through, and you go, okay, yeah, wait a minute, this isn't so bad, is it? And I found, searching around on the web, this railroad model builder, Don Ball. He actually created a model of the Watkins photographic train, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Wow.
And this is how he traveled. He actually used the back half of the caboose there as a dark room, and he kept his chemicals and plates and everything in there. And this is the photographic operation that Collis Huntington underwrote. This was no small amateur endeavor, and that's why when this thing showed up in Virginia City or anywhere else, people knew that, okay, there's a serious photographer in town now. And I don't have a photograph of Watkins and his setup, but this is an identical setup used by William Henry Jackson here. This is actually in New Mexico, but this is what the Mammoth Plate camera looked like. These things were enormous. And it's amazing, they had to use the plate while it was wet, so they coated these plates, put them into the camera, made their exposure, took them out and developed them, and they had to do all of this under tight time constraints, so if the plate dried out, it wouldn't work. And you can imagine the troubles these guys went through, especially in a dry, hot desert environment. And it's absolutely astounding to me that they made such amazing photographs that are not only technically competent, but they captured artistic views with this equipment. So back to Gold Hill, in another one of Watkins' Mammoth plates, and you can see a lot of details in these things. You can see a train coming over the trestle there at I can't quite see all of my notes here, but I guess that's the Crown Point trestle. And again, thanks to the Virginia and Truckee guys, we've still got this same train running in about the same place these days. You can see over in the, I don't know if anybody can see my pointer. Right here in the lower left, you can see actually the tunnel that the old track used to run through, and part of that is caved in. So they've wisely just skirted the track completely around that tunnel. But you can see, if we go back, you can see the tunnel there. So yeah, this is just above the actually right off the highway that makes the big hairpin S turns between Gold Hill and Virginia City. And this is an interesting one. It's been referred to as the Wheeler Monument in a lot of the publications about Watkins photography. And, I think most of the folks that are writing art books about old photographs don't realize that just some interesting outcrops can sometimes look like monuments. And this is just a hydrothermal breccia on a fault in Virginia City, and the Wheeler Monument is actually right behind me, and that's a really cool thing. If you've never seen it in Virginia City, it's the topographic monument that the Wheeler Survey topographic engineers erected as a latitude longitude control point. And it's a rather amazing monument, and you can still read the latitudes and longitudes that they chiseled into the stone there. And it's a pretty cool thing. And he was basically standing right below that when he took this shot. It looks like this today. And again, the trees, right? It's a real challenge even finding these views sometimes, because you just got to get between the right two trees, and then the view kind of goes, oh, right, this is it. But, on all these that we've well located, we've got GPS coordinates now, so it's pretty easy. This is up at the Sierra Nevada Hoisting Works, and this was a rather amazing mine, because a lot of work and money was expended here, and from all the reports I've read, probably not a ton of ore ever came out of the ground here, but a hell of a lot of rock came out and a lot of wood went down. This is you can see the wood stacked up here from the California forestry operations. It's just an amazing amount of wood that was going into these operations, and his photographs illustrate that very nicely. But the interesting thing about this is a view from 1876, and in all of the Watkins catalogs, this one is listed as 1878. But he came back actually in 1876. Again, just the view here. Note the looks like it may be a couple of young kids standing there posing. Very common theme for Watkins. And then he came back in 1878 and shot the Sierra Nevada Hoisting Works again. And you can see in this photo, the building has been enlarged to the south. The dump is much bigger. They've actually got some rail tracks set there. That first huge pile of wood that you saw has disappeared. They've either burned it up or they've sent it underground. And now they've got a lot of planed timbers, probably for square set underground support in the view here now. And in the Watkins catalog, this one is listed as 1876. So, as a geologist, I tend to look at things through stratigraphic eyes, and I could see the differences here. And, clearly all the cataloging that's been done got the dates on these wrong, because this one has to be later. So, it's one thing you can sort of see when you go out and try to recapture these views, is you can glean some more details about the archival attributes of these photographs. And again, people posing, somebody waving. And that's what it looks like today. Interestingly, the road is still pretty much in the same place. So now we're going to move down to the Carson River. We're going to move out of the hills where all the ore was dug up, or lots of holes were dug looking for ore. And we're going to go down to the Carson River and and take a look at where a lot of the milling took place. And, I was looking up on the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection, and they've got a really cool map there that shows all the mill sites related to the Comstock. There's a total of 236 mill sites. And many of these are down on the Carson River for the obvious reason is you've got water power. And, there's those two things alone are sort of, missing in the Virginia City and Gold Hill area. It's just too dry up there and there isn't any surface water. So a lot of the ore came down here by rail. This is the Santiago mill. The the Carson River Canyon is a tough place to photograph. It's always got bad light in it. It's always dark on one side and bright on the other. But this is what that mill site looks like today. So, pretty much not much evidence of it, right? You could walk around down there and maybe find some junk and trash, but you maybe wouldn't imagine that there was a big mill complex here back in the day that looked like this. Now we're looking down the river at the Vivian Mill, and you can see the railroad coming in from the left here through a cut in the hills here. And you can see the amazing infrastructure that they used. They had a dump here and an ore chute coming down the steep side of the canyon here. This is basically angle of repos. And they trammed the ore across the river on a bridge here, and it got milled right here. And of course they had cut this ditch here to provide water for the mill and probably for a power wheel in there somewhere. And today it's pretty much all gone. Although the railroad grade is still there, the track has all been pulled up, but you can drive along this road, which is what I did to get down here. And that's what it used to look like. And more recently, I found some really high resolution Watkins photographs from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They've got some of these online that you can just download. And they have actually two of the Eureka Quartz Mill setting, and this is a really cool area where you can see they've got a flume to send water down to the mill, and on top of the flume they've got a little narrow gauge train track. All of this is excavated out of hard rock. They must have used a lot of explosives to lay this thing in. And it's pretty much reclaimed itself today. Not a heck of a lot of evidence of the flume and the tracks there. You can still see the foundations of the mill down there, but otherwise, this canyon looks kind of like it probably did before they started construction there. Yeah, and here's one of my favorite Watkins. I mean, talk about staging people. He had a little train car here, a little personnel carrier, it looks like. You had people here on the tracks. You had people up here at the entrance to probably the primary crushers of the mill. And all of these features sort of add great depth to his photography. And then on second look, you see this really petite little buggy sitting over here. And when you zoom in on that image, it seems to be full of children. Like there's a set of triplets in this thing. I don't know what the story is, but there's three really young kids laying in this buggy, all in their white, Sunday best. And, obviously staged for Watkins' photograph. Probably an interesting backstory there. And it looks sort of like this today. Kind of looks like a camping and fishing pull off on the road. Not much to be seen really of any of this. And then we work our way back towards Carson City. This is up at the Brunswick Mill. Carson City's just behind this low flat ridge in the middle ground there. And this is a pretty interesting milling location. You can see settling ponds and whatnot, the railroad track coming through. And this was a big, probably amalgamating plates on this tail race to collect the fines coming out of the mill and catch whatever gold they did not catch in the mill, or at least have a second try at it. And this is a great view of how did the Carson River become a massive mercury contaminated river system. Well, this is how right here. Today it looks pretty much like this. The old railroad grade is just a recreational access road now that comes back back around the Brunswick Canyon Materials Company. This is still that mill site is now an active aggregate mining operation. And every time I would, obviously you can probably see from this photograph that I'm up on a cliff kind of perched over the road here. And Watkins oftentimes like to find a location like this with a great view. And whenever I come upon these places, I'm looking around thinking, man, I might be able to find something that guy left behind to prove that he was here. But and unfortunately, I've never found anything. But the views are always amazing, so it's worth it each time. And of course, in the fall, it's a beautiful river valley. Colors up, and that's what the old Brunswick mill site used to look like in there. So speaking of mercury again, and kind of how things used to be back in the day, here's the Woodworth mill, which isn't really a mill. It's more of a massive tail race operation where they must have had a milling operation up Daney Canyon that sent a slurry down this flume, which is on the trestles, and then over to this almost flat tail race thing that again the guys are posed on. And look how evenly distributed the people are here. It's kind of like Watkins must have drew something on the tail race and said, stand here. And they all did that. And what's coming off the tail race in this big flat area here, which is the Carson River floodplain, the Carson River runs back here. This is the tailings, right? So this is everything that came off the tail race, including gold that was lost and mercury that was consumed. And today it looks pretty much like this. So we've seen places where nature is taking herself back, and you can hardly see any evidence of man ever doing anything there, to a place where we've completely covered a tailings area with new houses here in the Santa Maria Ranch Phase 1 building development just outside of Dayton. So again, kind of an interesting view of different mentalities about how we can use land and what's okay and what isn't. We hear a lot of things about, oh my God, we're mining all this area and we're destroying it and we can never do anything with it again. Well, turns out you can do something with it again. So that's basically my talk. I wanted to leave you guys with some references. Anybody that's interested in looking more of this, and if you happen to have these kind of books on your bookshelf, you're probably a closet rephotographer. I don't know. And just if anybody's interested in finding these photographs for yourself, you can always ping me and I'd be happy to give them to you. But if you like searching around on things, there's some fantastic libraries, including the Berkeley Library, the Getty Museum, Research Archives, the Library of Congress, One of the best ones probably is California's online archive of California. There's amazing photographs on that site. And then of course the Met Museum is now starting to post some of the Carlton Watkins photographs. So these are great places to go spend some time and dig up old photographs. And that's basically my story. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions or discussions, or have somebody tell me why Virginia City is covered in trees now and it didn't used to be, or whatever.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly. I think Mike has his hand up.
I can't see my hand, so I must have a question. And that really is, where did Watkins also go to other mining camps?
Yeah, he did. He spent a fair amount of time in the active California mining camps of the day, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then maybe just a question for you: when you're trying to choose a spot, are you basically looking at the skyline, the hill pattern and things like that first to kind of get oriented?
Yeah, that's kind of the first approximation, Mike, is the skyline and what's the topography, what do the hills look like. But then it starts getting more difficult when there's more and more things in the foreground that you have to line up, and that's sure. Where my rephotography usually fails, and I've got to go out a second or a third or a fourth time to get it right. And some of these I've never been able to get them right, and it's kind of frustrating. And you come back home and you go, man, I blew it again. What the hell happened here? But it's usually a matter of, there's just so much detail in the foreground and the middle ground and the background. And if you don't if you don't find the point exactly right, one or all of those things are not going to line up, and it just doesn't work. But when it does work, it's super satisfying, because you can kind of look at your feet and go, damn, this is where Watkins was. He was standing right here.
Yeah.
It's cool. I think it is anyway.
Did he use any stereo views?
Yeah, he probably produced as many stereo views as he did these mammoth plates. And I think that was probably his bread and butter photography. Those guys could sell those for a few pennies. These mammoth plates were probably shot for customers, guys who owned these mills, owned the mines, and were willing to pay for the trouble that he had to go through to get these mammoth plates. So they weren't really for public consumption. And that's why, for many years, actually, some of the big libraries, of some of the Ivy League schools, for example, they had folios of Watkins mammoth plates. And he was so unknown and nobody knew anything about him that they actually disposed of some of these things.
Oh, no.
And then people started discovering him, and his images on eBay now will sell for a small fortune. So, but it's just the mammoth plate stuff. You can still actually buy his stereographic things for reasonable cost. So yeah, long story. He made a lot of different kinds of photographs, and I've been focusing on his mammoth plates because of the detail in them. That's what really kind of catches my eye.
Hey, Kelly, how are you?
Good.
Two questions. One is, how do you deal with the different formats between today's digital and whatever format they were shooting in, and how do you get the photos to line up? Because I've been trying to do this for an area I've been investigating.
Trial and error.
Okay.
I'm sorry to say, although there is a way where you can actually, if you've got an iPad or a tablet or something that you can run your camera with,
right,
you can load up one of these old images on the screen of that camera controller.
Okay.
And so that your view then shows you a superimposed image on that,
right,
and you can move around until they're approximately lined up.
Yeah.
That's technology I haven't really tried in the field, but I don't know why the heck it wouldn't work. And if you're really having troubles, if it's a really complicated shot, And of course, the other thing to keep in mind is these guys were using view cameras, right? So they could tilt the lens, they could do some shifting of the back relative to the lens. So if you're like me and using a normal, DSLR or something, you probably don't really have that ability, and there's no way to know how they might have tilted the lens or shifted the back. And if they've done that, God help you, you're just not ever going to be able to figure out how they
Right.
captured that view.
Yeah. So
And I think sometimes, these images, they're old, right? And they get scanned, and maybe whoever scanned them turns them back into a square image, but maybe they weren't quite square when they scanned them. So there's a lot of places for this to go wrong. And that, again, when it goes right, it's very satisfying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I've been trying to use some to prove that photos were taken where I know they were instead of where they
yeah.
said they were.
Yeah. Well, keep at it. You just go back and try again.
Yeah.
You'll get it.
Have you ever looked at James Crockwell's photos from Virginia City?
No, I haven't actually.
Yeah, I want to say he even put a book out about Virginia City. It would be in the mid to late 1880s, early 1890s. He happens to have shot a bunch of pictures in the railroad mining district.
Oh,
Shot the only pictures basically in the 19th century. And so I've been
Crockwell?
looking at his, CROC. Yeah, it's Crockwell.
uh-huh.
I can't remember. You'll find it. It's easy to find.
Yeah, okay.
And he came out of Salt Lake.
Okay,
So there's a lot of the stuff over there.
cool. I'll check that out.
Okay. It was a great talk, by the way. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Hey, Kelly, Greg, what's your idea on the lack of timber before and the trees today?
Well, my idea, and I've kind of developed this idea after lots of argument with other folks. I gave a presentation similar to this at GSN a couple of years ago, and the sort of the consensus of the crowd there was, well, yeah, of course there's no trees. They chopped them all down, right? They were using them for fuel and for timbering and for construction. And I think there's an element of truth to that. But what you don't see is any stumps. You don't see where trees have been ripped out of the ground, and you don't see any evidence of those trees being chopped down. And Watkins' photos are so detailed. I believe you'd see that on these slopes. So, my thought was, well, there just weren't any trees, and we're in a climate now where the trees are moving into this area, and they probably have been for 100 years because there's some pretty old trees out here. So I started looking around at old photographs of a similar vintage throughout the West, in some of the mining camps in Utah, in Idaho, and elsewhere. And the same theme actually kept hitting me in the face is, man, there just isn't any trees in these views, or they're much reduced. And so I started digging into it, and, for sure there's, documented cases in Montana where the Forest Service has been doing rephotography over the last 50 or 60 years. And the trees are growing and expanding in the range that they've been photographing, without any human intervention. It's just the trees are on the uptick. So I think, it's just kind of a common theme in the West that in the 1870s and 80s, there just weren't very many trees here. They were all in California, and they hadn't really come to, this part of Nevada at that time.
Well, I mean, just a side point, but here in places in Missouri where it used to be tall grass prairie, it's been left alone. It's gone to cedar, and eventually it will be oak hickory. It may take it hundreds of years to get to oak hickory.
Yeah.
But the cedars have come into places where, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was nothing there but tall grass prairie. So
Yeah. Well, and
ecological succession,
That's right. And, the BLM here in Nevada is is on a death hunt for, pinyon pines that are encroaching on the sagebrush habitat, right? So,
Oh, yeah,
You
the
know,
PJ thing of,
yeah,
And
the tree
sage-grouse, yeah.
lines, they just move around with time. And
yeah.
so I think that it's more or less of a natural succession here, but
Hey, Kelly, this is Dana Bennett. There was actually
Yeah.
some human intervention early in the 20th century in Nevada. The state paid a bounty to folks to plant trees in the early 1910s. And so that we see a lot of remnants of those trees. They would be just a little bit over 100 years old, but there was a concerted effort in the early part of the 20th century to plant trees.
yeah.
Dana, where was a lot of that concentrated? Do you know?
I don't know for sure. I became familiar with it with my research in Midas in Elko County. It's
Okay.
a town that started in 1907, and you don't see any trees and no stumps in the pictures except sagebrush stumps. And then they start appearing in right around 1912, 1913.
Okay.
Wow, that's really cool. I didn't know that.
Great presentation, by the way. This was fascinating.
Oh, thank you. It's been a lot of fun putting it together.
Yeah, Kelly was. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question. This is Jane here. Do you know if any of those photographs were used by the mining companies for promotional purposes?
That's the common thinking in the guys who have studied Watkins, yes, is that he was sent out here by the guys who owned the mines to gather photographs and probably go raise money. What the heck was he doing at the Sierra Nevada mine, which never produced a ton of ore, right? That was completely a promotional scam, probably, and he probably helped them raise money. And just as an interesting aside, before he came over here to Nevada, he had kind of made himself famous at the time for his Yosemite photography, and a lot of that photography ended up, back in Washington, D.C. and became part of the discussion and an ultimate, result of turning that into a protected area. So his photographs were very influential in the day. Yeah.
This is Henry Cherlev.
Hi, Henry.
Hi. I want to first thank you for the presentation. That was great. I don't want to forget about that. I don't have a question, but I have a comment that there is a coffee table book done when the Custer expedition went to South Dakota. Some of you are probably aware of this. There was a photographer along with that expedition, took somewhere near 30 photos, and the Forest Service in South Dakota went and put brass caps. They located those photography points, and then a book was written with comparative photographs, just as your presentation was done, of what it looked like during Custer's expedition and what it looks like now.
Oh, cool.
Great series, and funny or strangely enough, those became sites for geocaching. So I'm kind of an avid geocacher, and I went to some of those photographic points, and amazingly, there's not much of a change. Of course, we're looking at photographs not in a mining camp, but just not much change at all. So I'm traveling right now, so I don't have any information on that book, but I can certainly get it when I get back home.
Yeah, that's cool. I'd like to see that.
Yeah, it's a great book. I call it a coffee table book. It's a large format book, but the black and white photographs against today's color. This is probably 10 or 15 years ago that this book was put together.
Okay.
So I'll try, and when I get back to Minnesota, I'll try and get that to you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Anything else? Any other questions?
Just to Kelly, great job. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very
Yeah,
much, Kelly.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
you. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for listening. It's been fun.